All right, I believe we're streaming live now. So welcome to the advisory board. This is, for all the listeners watching live and recorded, this is your window into some of the conversations that happen usually behind closed doors about the biggest questions and issues being faced by the legal industry. And today's conversation it's really about systemic racism. I'm going to start by introducing the guest and the topic, and then we'll get the conversation started. Guest here today is Wendell Taylor, who is the managing partner of Hunton Andrews Kurth DC office and a member of the firm's competition and consumer protection practice. He is a co-chair of Hunton's Minority Attorney Subcommittee of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And he previously served as counsel to the Deputy Attorney General of the United States and as Special Assistant U.S. Attorney, District of Columbia. And of note, he also recorded something that was really wonderful that we'll talk about later in this conversation, I'm sure, about some of his personal experiences with racism. Cindy Ann Thomas, so good to see you, Wendell. Cindy Ann Thomas is the co-chair of Littler's EEO and Diversity Practice Group. She has over 20 years of experience as a strategic process diversity consultant and an employment attorney. And she works with the executives across industries, including in government, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, higher education, professional services. And she also records something that I'm sure is going to come up about how diversity and inclusion is might be strained and will be strained by the coronavirus epidemic and the kind of how we're hitting two really big moments at the same time. Loy Durant is Shepard Mullins' Director of Diversity and Inclusion and Talent Management Strategy. And it's a role that includes managing the firm's internal and external diversity and inclusion efforts. She has spent most of her career working at law firms at this point, including other large firms like White & Case and Case Shiller. So Wendell, Cindy Ann, and Loy, very good to have you here. So I'm going to briefly introduce the topic and then we'll get started. We all know why we're here talking about this topic. Around 3 weeks ago, the world watched in horror as George Floyd, a black man, was brutally killed by police. It's filmed, right? We watched earlier as Ahmaud Arbery was murdered in a hateful and racist attack, as Breonna Taylor, we learned, was killed in her home. And the truth is that these incidents don't represent something new. They are a pattern of police violence and a broader pattern of racism and pain being felt by millions of people in the Black community that goes back centuries. These events, though, did kick off protests around the country and around the world, and a broader, I'd say, recognition, elevation of this topic. And it started a conversation with friends, with family, and colleagues, including within our own profession, within law, law firms, corporate counsel, legal technology companies, and the entire broader legal ecosystem, right? And it's sad that it took this long to start this conversation, but it is a moment where the legal industry, like all industries, like all people, are recognizing that we must do dramatically more and take a much more active role in a fight against systemic racism, both within and outside our organizations. So I want to start this conversation with maybe kind of an open-ended question, but to start the conversation, I'm curious, how have the events of the last 3 weeks shifted the conversations within your firms and your organizations and with the people you work with?
I can start. I think the conversation has shifted drastically. I don't know what the polls would have shown before George Floyd about, whether people believe that police brutality against minorities existed. But I'm positive, that current polls would show overwhelming support for that proposition. Seeing the tape and, in the most generous characterization of the tape, which was a callous treatment by those officers of George Floyd's life, have provided kind of a watershed moment, I think. And it's really been kind of a call to action that nothing, has to date been that way. And so I think it's really moved the ball a lot. Informally, I'm getting calls from a lot of folks in the majority about what they can do and how they can help. So that's really positive as well. And formally, I think every firm and company even are looking at ways they can be more inclusive, and are looking really at this issue of systemic racism, police brutality, and they want to help. So some of the things that my firm's done, we've created this resource center that gives ways to give back philanthropically, also provides ways to support those that have been accused of crimes. Since we're lawyers, it's always good to kind of lend our services that way. And then we've taken actions such as supporting the removal of Confederate statues in Richmond and things like that where we were based. And so those are kind of some of the things that Hunton's doing, and I know other firms are kind of doing that too. But I think this really was a call to action.
I think probably the biggest shift in the conversation has been that we've not been using euphemism to talk about racism. And the first time we've been just saying the word racism and systemic racism instead of, calling it bias or explicit bias versus implicit bias. And the work that it takes for people to describe their experience, where they have to constantly think about the discomfort that everyone else is feeling about just saying that racism is a thing, I found it remarkable that we've kind of just said, okay, as a collective, we accept that this is a thing and now we can talk about it. And that just makes having the conversation easier and more productive, right? Because you're not doing mental gymnastics trying to figure out how to describe something without using words that people are uncomfortable hearing.
That's a really good point, Lloyd.
Agreed. One of the realizations in the last few weeks as a result of this is that organizations are now painfully aware that the catalyst for this national and global outcry is not limited to the explicit practices that exist within law enforcement institutions. There's an acknowledgement that there is systemic racism in many institutions, and there's been this massive awakening about the reality of that institutionalized racism. And the conversations that I'm hearing, certainly internally, are a newfound importance on a couple of things. First, acknowledging, right, and being accountable, and being publicly accountable. And to Lois's point, saying the words, marginalization, racial injustice, inequity, they are not nuanced, which is refreshing in many ways. A desire to have the courageous conversation, to wade into these waters, and action planning. The question of where do we go from here? Because there's a real desire not to have this moment in history be just a footnote.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
for that I am grateful.
What Lloyd said, I think that's such a powerful point because, you can look at companies who put out statements about what happened, and, some of them have been judged pretty harshly, and, some have gotten, favorable views said about them. Really, it comes down to the ones that are honest enough to really say the words. I mean, it's like we're all looking at these statements with this bingo card in front of us. The bingo card has things like racism, bias, police brutality, white privilege, and, systematic racism. You don't have to hit every one to fill up a bingo card, but if you make a statement and you don't hit any boxes on a bingo card, it's like the reverse bingo, and somebody stands up and says, this isn't it. And so I think really using those terms is really a good level setter so we can all be talking about the same thing. That was a great point, Lloyd.
It really is.
Thank you. I will say, I didn't talk about internally. I think public acknowledgement and not being silent both internally and externally is important. But I think as firms are thinking about their response to this and really taking advantage of this opportunity where there is collective outrage and not wasting the moment, as Cindy Ann just said, means also looking inward, right? So there's systemic racism that affects our society, but our organizations are not immune from the effects of systemic racism. So I think you have to look externally. You have to express your support. You think about supporting organizations, but you also have to start looking at your own infrastructure and your own processes beyond what we've been doing. Now that we have this collective understanding, or we've level set it at a new place, like we have to go back and look at our processes and see how we can improve our own little ecosystems, right? And how we can affect what's going on outside.
And that's a good segue to, I think, a topic that I'd love to ask you guys about, guys and gals. We, each of you work on diversity either within your firm or with, advising other Fortune 500 companies, educational government institutions, other law firms. And to some extent, there were already these pre-existing conversations about diversity and inclusion. That's what you guys are working on. But I feel like what you're saying is and what I've heard and what I've seen too, is that the conversation is shifting, and there's a recognition that what we've been doing so far is not enough, and not even close to enough. And what do you think must change? Like this week, what must change this week? What must change in the coming months and years? What do you expect to change?
But let me start. We keep having this conversation, Jake, right? Think about the call to action that Sarah Lee, GC, Rick Palmore started 20 years ago, right? And the reality is we do not do different very well in this industry. We like precedent, don't we? And that commitment to tried and true has not been serving us well. So, if we want something different, we're going to have to do something different and real change. I appreciate that takes time, and we are a time-sensitive industry as well. But we simply have to explore less supposedly tried and true methods of recruiting, hiring, mentoring, networking, allocating work, right? For instance, the Refer a Friend program, as an example, right? In terms of getting new people into an organization. And I'm going to date myself back here, but if anybody remembers Chris Rock on a stint on Multiracial Friends back in 2009, Kill the Messenger, when he joked that all his black friends had a bunch of white friends, but that all of his white friends had just one black friend, right? And it was, of course, hilariously delivered. But by 2014, we found out in a very serious study that Chris Rock was absolutely right. And the social circles for 90% of white Americans are comprised of other whites, with just 5% of white Americans having friends of other races. And when I say friends, I don't mean neighbors or business associates. Friends, right? Who's coming to your Friday night dinner table? Well, 3 months ago, right? Who's coming to your birthday party, right? Who is on speed dial on your contact list? Who's on your personal board of directors or in your circle of trust? So law firms refer a friend programs that are generically targeted to the current attorney population are fundamentally flawed when you consider the statistical reality. And this is not a cry for white Americans to go get some black friends, okay? But the reality is in light of that tried and true Prefer a Friend program where, well, we know that you went to Stanford or you went to Vanderbilt, so the people that are in your circle, they're going to be great here. That dedication to creating institutions of mini-me's, right, in a profession that is still 83% white, where black attorneys make up 3.6% 6% of big law ranks, right, these types of programs, they're going to have to be overhauled. That's one example.
I can kind of pick up there. I mean, it kind of dovetails on some of the implicit bias training that, some law firms and others have had recently. And I think we should really double down on those. And it's funny I say that because, we talked a minute ago about being very honest about the terms, but the term implicit bias really is a softening of other terms in a way that's palatable. And I think it's useful in that way because it's not like we're saying, hey, you're a part of institutional racism, which now I think this conversation shifted to that. But when we talk about bias, when I watch a boxing match and it's a white guy fighting a black guy, I reflexively pull for the black guy. And I think we should all be honest that those are things we do, and we can take the sting away from it when we say we all do it. The problem is black people really don't have the power in these institutions, whether it's corporate America or the legal profession. And so, I'm not going out and picking people based on my bias because, me as a collective group don't have the power. But when we say you have the power, and if you have that implicit bias, you have to counteract that. So when law firms use this, we all hire the best and the brightest. And so, you've got to be at the best law schools and have the top grades. And then we come and, interview a bunch of people. But after that, it's usually based on what we call fit. It's not just my firm, it's other firms. But what do you mean by fit, right? When you have a white male that's saying, well, I just fit in better with this person, or I think that person will fit in better here. It's up to us to realize that, part of what they're saying is, well, that person looks like me and belongs to the clubs I belong to, and therefore we need to pull away from that. I think what's really helping us to pull away from that are our clients. Our clients have customers that look more like us and more like diverse communities, and those clients have really come to the firms and said, look, don't come on a pitch and bring all white men anymore. I want to see diversity, and not just at the pitch now. Don't just bring them to the pitch and don't give them any work. I want to know that those folks are working on my matters. And now, don't just have them work on my matters. I want to know that those minorities and women are getting credit for the work they bring in. So I think what's really helping to change this conversation are clients who are really pushing us in the right direction. Because we know lawyers will do whatever our clients tell us to do. They say jump, we say how high. If they say we need more minorities coming to these meetings, we need minorities who have credit for these matters, law firms will do that very willingly because that's the way they're going to move their organizations forward in the 21st century.
Yeah, actually, on that point, Cindy Ann mentioned the Sarah Lee's general counsel when they almost 20 years ago threw down a diversity challenge. She also mentioned this, by the way, in the great recent podcast she did on Littler's diversity and inclusion podcast, I recommend. And question I have for you all is there a role? A lot of folks in the client position now, the general counsel and house counsel are listening in. What other things can they do? How can they step it up? Are there things that they should be doing, must be doing right now that can go even further there? Is it time now for a new challenge like the one that Sarah Lee's general counsel laid out? Is that what part of the story can that play?
Look, I think there's certainly more that general counsels can do. I think that most law firms have created their internal diversity programs based on external pressures, right? It's based on industry organizations, surveys, recruiting, clients, right? And so it's all external. And what that has done is eliminated the attention we pay to staff in law firms, right? We all started by talking about processes that affect the attorney population. And so in large part, we have ignored what is probably in most law firms the most diverse population in our firms, right? We're not talking about recruiting, retaining, and promoting people at the staff level, right? And I get it, right? The lawyers are the foundation of the business, right? They give the services. But if we're going to start talking about creating inclusive communities, we have to expand the conversation to talking about just attorneys. And I don't mean we stop paying attention, and we need to pay more attention to these issues on the attorney side, but we also have to start looking at the entire firm and and holding accountable each other and your law firms who are not doing or considering these issues across the board.
And Lois, if I may just pick up with respect to the issue of accountability, to that point, I think another measure that we must start seriously looking to is a dedicated diversity officer. And, you know, it's a full-time job. Committees of passionate, philanthropic attorneys who have 2,000 hours a year billable requirements, they cannot possibly do their jobs effectively and take your firm to the next level in the D&I space if you are really looking to go to another level.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
But I also think that we should be looking across, you know, you have a diversity officer, but looking across all your administrative functions to make sure that diversity is being considered all the time, right? And it's not just when your dedicated diversity person is in the room. And that there is some training across the board about how we consider those issues within, you know, the specific area of focus, right? So marketing and recruiting and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It can't just be your one diversity person is running around in circles trying to figure it out for everyone. We need to be demanding a level of expertise and awareness around diversity issues across all these functions where folks can do it without having, you know, your diversity person in the room.
Well, I'm curious, do people typically hold your position within law firms? You know, but not just at Sheppard Mullin, but everywhere. Are they typically tasked with looking at the administrative roles and the non-attorney roles, or has it been really driven, again, kind of by client and statistics and recruiting their demands to really focus on attorneys so far? That does sound like, you know.
I think that we think about diversity, at least historically, as the, you know, recruitment, development, advancement of lawyers. And then it evolved into diversity and inclusion, where you're looking at the inclusiveness of your organization. But I think when it is built on a foundation that started off as a focus on the legal side of the house, right, or on your fee earners, right, and I get it, we have to focus on that, we must. It's almost like a second thought about how you also think about how you're including everyone in the conversation and having everyone feel like inclusion also means them. Yeah,
makes a ton of sense. You know, to maybe build off the topic of inclusiveness, it's slightly different, I guess. I want to talk about what's happening right now, right? I know a lot of folks within law firms, within companies, are turning to their Black colleagues right now to ask how they can help, how they can be handling this moment. And, you know, I'm curious what you think about that approach. Obviously, we talked about this a bit when we were kind of preparing for this. You know, how do you feel like colleagues and allies should be acting right now towards their, you know, Black associates, for example, at law firms?
I would start by referring to Cindy Ann's point earlier about white people not having Black friends, but Black people having white friends. So this has been horrific and traumatic for everyone. It's been more horrific and traumatic for Black Americans. I had amazing outreach from my many white friends, for whom I'm probably their only Black friend. So at a time when you're emotional, traumatized, and exhausted, that's when the outreach comes. I think that there has to be, on a human level, the desire to do some of the education and the legwork yourself before going to your Black colleagues and friends and asking them how they can help you help them right now. There are some Black people who want to share their experiences and want to educate, and I think that's great. And I think that there's some that are tired and want a moment. And I think that what we have to be thinking about is how we engage Black people and ask for their perspective all the time, not just when it is the most dramatic, outrageous time, and they're processing, right? So 8 months from now, when this isn't headline news and they're not being bombarded, happy to have a glass of wine with you and talk about the Black experience in America. Right now, I'm being pulled in 1,000 directions and trying to figure out what I feel. And so I think that is a tension where Black people say, I don't want to be responsible for educating people. I don't think that we don't understand that there is a responsibility to educate and make sure people understand the experience. I think it's the timing of that expectation. At least I'm speaking for myself.
To Lois's point, if you were not seeking out that Black colleague before, it may come across as disingenuous at this point and pretty self-serving. This may be an opportunity for all of us to think about what our check-in culture will look like as leaders in peacetime, right? And if we can learn anything from this crisis, it is to start developing those relationships now, to Lois's point, so that when the next crisis comes along, and sadly, it probably will, that phone call that you make to your Black colleague won't feel so odd to that Black colleague, right? But, again, this isn't a Black issue, it's a humanity issue,
right.
Really. And I would like to think that, knowing how to communicate your empathy and your acknowledgments and your pledges to do better as a fellow citizen and colleague should not necessarily need Black counsel.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. So I've struggled with this one a great deal, and I've talked to a lot of Black attorneys that are, both inside my organization and outside. And I've got, a couple sentiments from them, and that's, some like or said what Lois said, and they're just tired, they're hurt, they are traumatized by what's happened, and they're not at all in a place to lead right now. They're not okay. Like one Black female in particular, said to me, her team asked her, "Are you okay?" And she says, "I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for a long time. I'm trying to put this professional face on. I can't do that and do my job and also lead this organization forward." I sympathize with that view. I totally get it. And then there are other people that kind of what, Cindy Ann was saying, they're just like, well, where were you, last year? And, why didn't you start this before? That's another sentiment that's kind of taking place too. And I also sympathize with that. I mean, I think we should, seize this opportunity. And it's not fair that we're, put in this role of, being the person that people turn to and say, okay, what do I do? But, the struggle's going on a long time. And I feel like if this is the time where people are saying, okay, I get it now, I want to do something positive, help me move in the right direction. I think it's partly our responsibility, but it's like Lloyd was saying, some people are better able to do that now than others. So the ones of us that can stand up and say, I want to be that person to say, yeah, you want to ask me what you should do? I'm going to tell you. And that's kind of what I am. If somebody asks me for advice, I'm going to always give it. And so I feel like I get all those points of view. And so, we're not one person. Like we are, Black community. It's all different of us. Some people are in different places with this, but, it's certainly not anybody's responsibility to do it. But if you feel the desire and you have the ability to lead your organizations, I think you absolutely should.
And Wendell, to your point, that Black attorneys are feeling so vulnerable and raw in saying, you know what, I'm not okay. That's a lot in the Black community, because when you keep in mind about the reality for Black communities, there has been a historical stigmatization pertaining to mental health or admitting that we're not okay, in light of the shame and some of the norms passed down that you never let them see you sweat. You're stronger than that. It's tied into the roots pertaining to spirituality and faith. So it's almost blasphemous. for some Black communities or people in Black communities to say that I'm not okay. So that says a lot, that many are not trying to be stoic about this, right?
Right.
There are some circles in white America where it's quite trendy to say, I'm seeing my therapist tonight. Not so much for Black folks.
Good point.
One thing that came out during this conversation is, it sounds like for all of you, you're also having conversations with your other colleagues, other Black colleagues within their firms, within your organizations. And I'm curious if you were to either share some of your experiences or give some advice to other people who, maybe in the exact same position, about helping kind of talk through these kinds of issues with your Black colleagues. What kind of advice would you give, or what are some things that you've done to hear people out as they're going through, both this terrible moment and also, potentially the bombardment of these questions from their white colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I tell people when I talk to them is what was just said by Cindy Ann. Take care of yourself. Take care of your mental health, and I just want them to know that I am there for them to just talk to. And I think, kind of to Lloyd's point, like sometimes people call you just to check on you to see if you're okay. Other times they're calling for you to tell them what to do. The conversations that are more about the person you're calling to make sure they're okay are probably more well received. And so part of what I do is just to be there and listen. And that's some of the things we've done at Hunton, is just have listening sessions with folks so they can talk about, what they're going through. And so I think that's really important, just to kind of, let everybody vent, let everybody kind of sit with it and feel the pain and know that your organizations are there for you. I think that's really one of the strongest things you can do for people in this moment.
Yeah. And can I just say that outreach does not have to be complicated. Just as a bit of a testimonial, just yesterday, a senior leader who is white and in my own firm, within the context of a business matter that I sought her input on via email, took the opportunity to write that she, and I quote, hoped I was okay, and that she was very grateful to have me as a colleague and a friend as we try to navigate this world. So I offer that just as an example of how we can check in with people. That was in the context of an already established and healthy relationship that I had with this individual. So it was simple, it was meaningful, it was genuine. Outreach does not have to be a complicated manifesto.
Yeah. And that is actually, I was going to make a similar point, which is to say, especially for lawyers, they're problem solvers. And you're here to, there's a problem, your job is to find solutions. You don't have to have a solution. There are no easy solutions to these very long-standing and complicated issues. And folks aren't looking for solutions. So maybe it's just, how are you doing? Or just listening, right? It doesn't have to be that you're trying to solve a problem for them in that moment. It's really just listening and acknowledging and offering to do more of that.
Wendell, you recently shared a speech. I think we're going to share it publicly with all of the audience listening here. I believe it's titled Our Pain.
Yeah.
And I expressed this to you before, but I found it very personally moving. It's personal, talking about some of your personal experiences and how you process it, what to do next. And the main point that you're making in that 13-minute speech is about building empathy. And I wonder, what advice would you have, would all of you have, about ways that folks anyone can build empathy, who wants to build empathy about the subject of racism, and have not lived these shared experiences? What are some of the ways, that you would recommend that we help build that, strengthen our empathy?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's so the George Floyd tape really had a deeply personal effect on me. I was amazed after watching it, that it didn't just have an effect on me, but it really did kind of galvanize a large majority of the country against police brutality, and to kind of just, have people really admit that there was a problem. And my assessment of, the difference, or what the watershed was that, people felt empathy. It's hard to not have empathy for a guy, being slowly murdered over 9 minutes, who's pleading for his life. And so I thought, well, I want to double down on that because the concept of empathy really, to me, is the first step in understanding that there's a problem and a path forward. And so I set out to, tell these stories of, my interactions with police and the negative times that I've, dealt with them. And I tried to do so in a way that allowed the listener to, feel my pain as I told the stories, in a way that we all felt George Floyd's pain when we watched that video. The advice I provided was, don't turn away, you have to watch. And so I think all too often, like, my partnership or my friends even hadn't heard any of those stories, because there's really never the right time to bring them up. And if you do so kind of casually, oh yeah, that happened to me, then it's just kind of flip. And it's like you said earlier when we're talking, it's just like kind of the CNN ticker, and you see another thing that happened to another nameless, faceless person, but when you just allow yourself to sit with it and hear the details and have those uncomfortable feelings about it happening, you hear that it happened to 11-year-old boy is leaving his backpack outside of a store because he's already labeled a criminal. It's hard to not feel that. And so I really do think that, this was a watershed for me to say, I need to tell these stories that really no one's heard. And they partly didn't hear them because it's painful for me to tell them. But I said to myself, I've got to feel that pain, because if I don't, and I want the listener to, it's not going to work. The listener will feel the pain because I do. And so, part of it is having an audience that's willing to listen. And sometimes you can see people's eyes glaze over and they don't want to hear it. So I think right now people are willing to listen. So there is power in telling that this happens over and over, so that folks don't just think, okay, it happened to George Floyd and Wendell Taylor and maybe nobody else. Well, no, it happens to a lot of us. And so once we get there, and it really does solidify that there's a problem, and it gets us all on the same page that we can move forward from, because we can never move forward from a problem until we admit that problem exists. And so that's the way to, fight injustice, because, like the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so I feel like we can rely on our partners in this. It was, women and the, Me Too movement. I am a champion for all those issues because I feel empathy for those things. I think we need to have this big tent, and that is what I think will help us move forward.
Amen.
So this is going to sound counterintuitive, especially for those of us in employment law. But we have to get away from the notion that being colorblind is a good thing. It doesn't help to move the needle in diversity, equity, and inclusion. The EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, may certainly not want us or our clients, for instance, in the employment law space, see color or race or ethnicity in making decisions. But if you are going to foster a meaningfully inclusive environment, you should want to be aware of those differences, right? You should want to use that knowledge as an opportunity to learn how to become an ally, to learn how to become a champion. And the questions can't all come from your Black colleague, but again, depending on your relationship with the right person, you should want to ask, what do you wish that I knew about your lived experiences? Or are there differences that have presented any unique challenges for you as a Black attorney in this firm? And if so, how have you dealt with them? And that goes against everything we know, certainly when we think about, certainly the intent behind being colorblind, but that means that we are on autopilot with respect to the real differences that exist as a result of people of color.
And I think to kind of dovetail on both your comments, I think sharing the stories of these small but regular incidences of racism that really get compounded. And when people get to see the effect of those small incidences of racism, they understand why it's hard for everyone, right? It doesn't have to be George Floyd and that horrific and extreme incident. But people are living every day, starting from Black people in this country, and Black and brown people and other people are living every day with active discrimination that is formative, right? That informs how they show up to work, that how they come into your organization. So the assumption that we're making is that everyone shows up and they all show up on the same level. We're never going to make progress. We're not acknowledging the trauma that people are walking in the door with.
Right. The reason I labeled it our pain, and the point of it was to feel the pain. You can look at it as my pain. We can look at it as the pain of the Black community. But really, the term and the title, our pain, this is our nation's pain. This is a struggle that the nation is going through. And so I don't like using the term ally for those in the majority who are with us. And I say in the talk, I feel like this is their fight too. This is America's problem. This is America's pain. And we all are in this together. So we can't look at it as it's an us issue that people are helping us with. This isn't our issue that are helping us with. This is their issue. This is our issue. It's America's issue.
Absolutely. I mean, I will share one of the three stories I think that you shared in our pain in the speech you gave was a moment where you were interning, you're UVA law, you're interning for a prosecutor's office, right? And you're yet still on UVA's law campus, still harassed. Oh, Richmond, sorry. Still harassed by police on campus. And, had to quote legal principles to kind of prove that you were in fact a law student and not there doing something illicit. And I think that for a lot of the lawyers who are listening, who may have also interned for the prosecutor's office for the government, but who didn't go through that. I mean, it's mind-boggling. To have to go through that kind of situation. I really recommend everybody who's listening and listen to the full talk. I'm not going to do it justice, obviously, but I think those, like Roy said, those kinds of small moments really matter.
That was
small,
probably,
but I mean,
that was probably the most surreal experience of my life, or at least one of the most surreal experiences. I was working at the prosecutor's office in the summer. I was at my law school. I was president of student bar, and I'm literally drafting a brief on behalf of the government for an interdiction at a bus station where a Black guy was stopped by a white police officer, and I'm, at this point defending that stop. And then I'm stopped by this officer in an unreasonable manner, and I quote to him Terry v. Ohio and the fact that he didn't have reasonable articulable suspicion to stop me. I'm standing in front of the law library. You can see law library right in front of us, and you would think that he's talking to a guy in a law building in front of a law library, quoting case law to him, but he didn't see any of that. All he saw was my skin color, and it was just so surreal that I was being stopped. It was another white cop stopping another Black guy, and I'm defending that same situation. But hopefully everybody will listen. I think it's pretty powerful, and it really has started conversations. I'm most proud of the fact that I've gotten emails from folks who said they've listened with their kids. Someone sent this as part of a sermon. There's a professor who used it as part of a lecture recently. So I'm really proud of it and just humbled by the responses I've gotten from it.
Yeah, I mean,
you should be, Wendell. It's an incredible piece.
It is.
Thank you.
It's very powerful.
And I think especially because I know a lot of our listeners are in the legal community. I think that if the job of creating empathy, I think, is really established because a lot of them, again, will have very similar life experiences. Going to law school, working, and will see themselves a lot in you and then see, okay, we just changed out one dumb variable, right? Simple as that, and all of a sudden, you have a direction. I found it. I hope it's being distributed widely within legal organizations as well. I'm doing everything I can to spread it because it's just awesome. Speaking of kind of things we've recently kind of recorded, done, I also got a chance to listen to Cindy Ann's podcast on Littler's podcast that Cindy Ann hosted about the impact that coronavirus is having right now, and it kind of raises the question. I'm curious, we have these two things happening at the same time, right? This conversation, these protests, in reaction to these horrific events, and in reaction to a long history, but immediately in reaction to these horrific events, and COVID. And I'm curious how that's affecting the conversation, and how how COVID might impact some of these things.
Right.
The kind of intersection of these two problems at the same time.
Right. And summarily, for anybody who may not have listened to the podcast yet, essentially what I was exploring in that is that we already have, we have an already oft invisible segment of our law firm population, Black and brown people, who then became further isolated as a result of either stay-at-home orders and then later safer-at-home orders or policies, and then to have had to deal with some of the fiscal reality that many law firms went through and are going through to weather the crisis, whether it was stopping 401k contributions or cuts for law firms across the country and really the world that range from 10 to 100%, right? So there's that fiscal reality. So many attorneys, by the time Mr. Floyd was killed, had already been psychologically and emotionally on the edge, right? This is in many ways a final straw. And then depending on how law firm leadership are handling and handling the crisis and reaching out to the individuals in question is making the difference, really, in terms of how attorneys of color, in turn, are responding and reacting. So it's really become a very compounded situation as a result of, it's truly an imperfect storm with respect to all of those things in the mix, right?
Right. Yeah, and when you look at the last downturn in the market and the Great Recession of 08 and 09, we know that it disproportionately affected minority attorneys. And so we all kind of know that happened. So when you're a minority lawyer, like you said, sitting at home, isolated, probably feeling the pressure of, well, is this going to happen to me too now, like it did to a lot of my brothers and sisters in 08 and 09. And then on top of that, you've got all these other issues that we've been talking about today with George Floyd and police brutality. It really does, cascading effect on your emotional self. And so I really tried to, I think we really should all take the time, and I know the folks in this call have, to reach out to those folks and make sure that they're okay and have them take care of their mental health because they do feel isolated, and do whatever we can in our organizations to make sure that what happened in 08 and 09 doesn't happen again.
Absolutely. And then keeping in mind that our attorneys of color are also members of communities which, as a result of COVID-19, we became painfully aware of how that pandemic is disproportionately affecting and, in fact, killing people in their communities, their families, right? We saw the statistics in terms of what, especially in certain hotspots like Louisiana, like Michigan, where although they may be 20 or 30% of the population, they represent 70% of the COVID-19 related deaths. So these are realities that are affecting members of our legal community. So it's just a multi-dimensional, kind of imperfect storm of crises all coming together that are really potentially having just a catastrophic impact on our attorneys of color in the industry.
Yeah. Imperfect storm is a great way to describe it.
Yeah.
I can't call it perfect.
Yeah,
No, correct.
I won't.
Like the stars didn't align. It's just
whatever the opposite of that is. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Cindy Ann, one thing you mentioned briefly, but I want to elevate because it's something that really spoke to me was, already there's this problem for minority folks within law firms of being invisible, sometimes to the people who are assigning work, giving out billable hours, et cetera. And that problem may also be compounded by work at home or safer at home, right? And to the extent, I know we have a lot of law firm leadership listening, I recommend both listening to the podcast and getting the fuller kind of in-depth conversation of those kinds of questions. But it struck me that one issue that, something that some leaders can be doing probably a better job of is being conscious of that implicit potential of passing over and not handing out work to people who may not look like them, that, they may not be as closely connected to for those kind of, dumb reasons, basically, right? And that seems like one thing that I'm not sure all law firm leadership is aware of. And I don't know if you want to add to that at all, but that really struck me as something that I could absolutely see happening in a law firm that is distributed now. And if not, just walking down the hall and see someone and say, hey, do that work.
We don't have the benefit, literally, of seeing some of the people who many of our law firm leaders across the country already did not see, and they were there. So now more than ever, we have to be more intentional. Law firm leaders, as law firm leaders, we need to be more intentional. We need to be more mindful. We're going to have to put more effort into really reaching out to, of course, all attorneys who are, subject to a billable hour requirement. There is already the stress of making sure that they can make that requirement before the end of this year, in a year where organizations, our clients that we serve, right, are economically stressed. So there's already that issue that all attorneys are feeling, but particularly since that invisible component now more than ever is truly invisible, if you will. You're not in the office. You're not running into them. You're not at firm meetings. We're just going to have to work twice as hard to reach out to make sure that they have an opportunity to get those billables that they're already stressed about.
Yeah. Wendell talked earlier about doubling down on unconscious bias training, but I also think it's doubling down on interrupting bias training, right? Mm-hmm. So you talk about work allocation, availability bias, right? That is the first person that pops in your head is the first person that gets the opportunity. But right. You can build into your processes steps that interrupt that bias. So are you making a list? Are you looking at who is truly available to do this work instead of jumping to the first conclusion that pops into your head? And I think in addition to doubling down on we all have biases, it's talking about cognitive biases that affect how we make decisions and giving people, tools and building into your processes steps that help us all not make that mistake.
That's absolutely, yeah. We all know that at law firm, the power really resides in the relationship with clients. And so, at Hutton is, in charge of the programming for minorities. We have a minority attorney retreat every 2 years and have been doing so since 1993. I've tried to move the focus of those from kind of the touchy-feely enrichment things internally to more targeting it to clients and getting clients involved in those things, having the clients know and meet the minority attorneys we have at our firm, coming to the event. because the clients have said, and I think the clients mean it, that they want diverse representation. They want women and minorities on their matters. So we have to hold our clients to that and say, here are the folks we have. And so it's kind of the work I've been doing and the work I want others to do is to make sure we are, when the clients ask for it, that we are putting our minorities attorneys in front of those clients, because that's what gives you power at firms. Billing time gives you job security, at least in the short term, but what gives you long-term job security and a way to wealth build is to have those relationships with clients. And the more we can be deliberate about that, the better off we are.
Definitely.
We only have a few minutes left. The last question I would throw out to the group is, we do have a few law firm leaders listening in right now. We'll be listening to recording. What are some questions you wish they would ask, or wish to be asking, or should be investigating right now?
I think Lloyd hit it on the head. It's like, write down that list. It's like, make sure you are, and she can say it a lot better than I can, but she just talked about that. It's like, how are you doling out work? What's the criteria that you're actually using? And Lloyd, if you want to pick back up on that, I thought that was a brilliant.
Have you actually thought about what the criteria is? Do you have objective criteria for what you think is the requirement for the person that needs to do this, right? Like, have you gone that far as to say, here's an assignment, the person on this assignment needs these skills, and then looking at your complete available pool, and then saying, here are the 5 people that qualify, and then think about who got the last 7 of those opportunities, right? How do you make sure that you're equitably distributing opportunities, right? So it's not that, because this is the person that's best at this because they've gotten to do it 10 times, so now they get to do it forever. Like, we have to start really thinking about how we distribute opportunities in a way that everyone gets to build skills. So it's not just one person that is ready when that great opportunity comes. But it's also not forgetting that people might have skills that, because they're not at the top of your mind, you are not acknowledging or ignoring. And so, I think law firms can be asking that question. I think law firm leaders can really, maybe now is the time to listen, right? I think now's the time to listen. And, I'll tell you what I've been hearing a lot about both inside our firm and just talking to colleagues across industry is this idea of duality, right? And that you kind of take off your community or your personal self and you put on your professional self when you come to work. And we've done trainings for years now on authenticity. And just like we're dropping the euphemism and talking about racism, I think we can drop the we can talk about really being authentic and really talking about why some people don't feel like their personal selves fit in a professional setting. Why is that? It's not that it's unprofessional. It's just that we've defined professional in a very limited way, right? So we can start asking ourselves those questions too.
I will add one question to the list that we have here. Quite simply, to the right person, we can ask the question, how can I do better? How can I do better? But be prepared for the response that you get, right? And be willing to act on what you have heard. Because it's not just enough to ask. We will have to act.
Absolutely.
Well said.
I think that's fortunately all the time we have left, and I think a very good place to end. So I really want to thank Cindy Ann, Loy, and Wendell for joining the conversation today and sharing your expertise and your experiences. For those of you listening, I strongly recommend listening to the most recent episode, all episodes of Littler's Diversity and Inclusion podcast. Cindy Ann's recent one about the impact of coronavirus is really interesting, I believe. To Wendell's talk on called Our Pain, a link that we'll share, available on SoundCloud, and to take a lot of the things that were said here to heart. I think we'll probably be distributing notes and takeaways later, and hope this helps someone. So thank you again, and thank you very much for the conversation.
Great conversation,
Jake, Linda,
Jake.
Lloyd, it's been a pleasure speaking with all of you.
Yes, and then